Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is a Thursday at about 9:58, and it's another wintry day. It's snowing like crazy outside right now. So maybe we had a snow day, pretty big storm the day before yesterday. Had everything canceled pretty much that night. It started snowing pretty. It snowed during the day for a while, and then it stopped, and then it started snowing big time later on. We probably got almost a foot of snow, and now it's snowing again, and it's supposed to snow I think all day. So I don't know if it's going to be another snow wash of a day where things will be canceled. But oh well, what can you do? I do like the snow, but sometimes when things have to get canceled or shifted around, it's a pain in the butt. But what are you going to do about it? It hasn't been too much of an issue this year. There's been haven't had anything canceled that's been of, like, I guess big significance. We had one freakish little batch of weather where it was so cold that there were a bunch of cancellations, but things got moved on to later on that week, and we were able to still do the events. But we'll see. Today was going to be a really busy day for me, but right now it looks like it might not be a very busy day. So we'll see. But anyway, hope everyone's doing good. I want to thank everybody for their support. I love people checking out this channel. It's been a really fun journey with more and more, and I love, there's more and more people subscribing every day to the channel. So that's been really awesome. And most of all, I love that people are commenting more and more on these videos, and that's a lot of fun. I've had, through some conversations with people commenting on some of these videos on this channel, I've had a couple of really cool people make some recommendations for other films in those genres, and so that's been really, really cool. I did a couple of shows on some Japanese exploitation movies, and that was a new discovery, a really new discovery for me. And I've talked a lot about all of these great labels that now exist in the world of, well, in the world for collectors, people who buy Blu-rays and special editions, 4K releases, and what have you. And in particularly in the world of exploitation, there's so many great companies. But my favorite, and I've talked about it before, is Mondo Macabra. They're just phenomenal. And that's a label I discovered a couple of years ago. And pretty much every film I've gotten through that label I've never seen before. And they really take, out of all the labels that are out there, and again, there's so many. There's Severin, there's Blue Underground, there's Synapse. There's just so many. But out of all of the labels, and again, there's so many great ones. But out of all the labels, from what I find, Mondo Macabra takes like the deepest dive into the world of exploitation, where they really, I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of films that they cover, but then also what the films are that they showcase. They really specialize in all kinds of European films, a lot of mostly foreign films. Pretty much there's only been one, I think there's only one film that I have that is an American film in my collection. I could be wrong, but most of them, about 90% of the films that I've come across, and also the movies that I've been buying, have all been foreign films. Lots of Italian films, lots of Spanish films, more recently Japanese films, even movies from like the Philippines, some French films. Just wild, literally from every part of the world. And the level of the sheer diversity that they have too is the other thing that I'm really blown away by. I mean, they have giallo films. They have sex exploitation films. They have, quote unquote, like action films. They have all kinds of great horror films. It's just phenomenal. And I've been taking a chance because pretty much every movie I've seen in their catalog and that I've bought, I've never seen before, and every movie I've gotten has been just total gold, and I've been super excited. So like I did 2 shows recently on 2 recent Mondo Macabre, probably my last 2 or my most recent purchases from that label. I did 2 videos on these really obscure Japanese films, and just blown away by how good they are. And there was a guy who had just subscribed, and he commented, and he made some recommendations, like if you like this movie or this kind of style, check this out. And that's one of the coolest things about doing this channel is, and then for me in general, just on my own terms, like discovering all of these new films, and then also always as a reference point or a starting point that kind of leads me to check out a lot of these other films that I've never seen. It's always usually the starting point is always a film that I saw, particularly an old school horror film or exploitation film that I saw when I was a kid, and that I, you know, just bought a new edition of it. So awesome. So today's show is going to be about a pretty old school horror movie, a movie that was a real big part of my youth when growing up. It was one of the first, I guess you could say, occult themed horror films, or like occult themed exploitation movies. I kind of consider it to be a really, it's definitely a super uber low budget horror film, and I kind of consider it to be a movie I would put in the kind of horror exploitation world, because it has all those it has all of those kind of characteristics. It's like, uber low budget. It's pretty silly. Some pretty cheesy acting, but it's a great story, and it's an awesome movie. And it really was one of those movies that really got me into horror, especially around films that were dealing with, the more supernatural elements. And that is this movie right here, The Gate. Such an awesome movie. I just revisited this. I just started watching it again last night. Unfortunately, I don't have this on Blu-ray. I will need to do that at some point. But this is such an awesome movie. And again, this was a movie I saw when I was a kid, back in the days of VHS. I had just, gotten really into heavy metal music. I was, listening to a lot of, my first couple of bands that I got into that were, quote unquote, like my exposure to metal music, bands like Iron Maiden. And then I eventually got into more extreme music. That's when I discovered Metallica. I would say Master Puppets was probably my first, like, thrash metal album, and then eventually got into, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning. I was a huge Metallica fan. I still like Metallica. I've been listening to some of their tracks for their new album that's coming out, and I actually like it. It's actually pretty good. I'm kind of impressed. For a long time, I didn't really stay up on all things Metallica, and there's certain albums of theirs I like in the later period I wasn't, really excited about. But, they were a huge part. They were the band that introduced me to extreme music, this newer form, at least at that time, of thrash music that was, a little bit more aggressive than music like Iron Maiden. And it was that they were the first band that kind of introduced me to heavy music. And then, like, I got into Anthrax after that, and bands like Exodus, all of, like, the Bay Area, Californian, all the bands that were coming out of California, the thrash metal bands. got really into that. And then I started getting into some of the European thrash metal bands. One band I really, really got into, which is still a band I really love quite a bit, and I actually just bought a reissued version of one of their classic albums, released from Agony. There's this really awesome band called Destruction from Germany. And they were a thrash metal band, and they're still actually a band. They just put out an album this year, which is just wild, and they're still going strong. They've been around forever, and they were one of the thrash metal bands that I remember where they suddenly had a little bit of a darker kind of vibe. They were a little bit darker than what Metallica was doing. They had a like this, the themes were a little darker. Their whole kind of thing was a little bit more sinister sounding. And then from there, I remember that's when I got into Slayer, and Slayer was a big shift for me because their music was much darker, way more aggressive than some of those initial thrash bands that I got into. They kind of took that thing and moved it into a higher level. And Slayer was the band that kind of got me into, eventually. Then I got into death metal. That's when they got me. I started really getting to more and more music that was more and more extreme. And from there, I got into all of the bands that came out of Tampa, all the classic death metal bands. Bands like Deicide, Obituary, Morbid Angel. I mean, the list is endless. Cannibal Corpse. That was like suddenly that was just like earth shattering, and that was all of this new heavy music that suddenly was like so extreme and so heavy and so dark, and it was the next level. And then fast forward a few years after that, I got into the whole Norwegian black metal scene, and that was even a higher elevated kind of experience for me. And that became, I still love the classic death metal band sound, and especially Morbid Angel and Cannibal Corpse. I still love those bands to death. But as far as extreme music goes, I would say that the whole black metal thing really kind of swallowed me up. That became my jam. And even now, I've had a real I don't know, rekindling or rediscovery of a lot of the black metal bands that I grew up on, and then also the so many great new bands I've been discovering in that genre. And that's all like in regards, all of this stuff is all in regards to the music that is in kind of the metal category. I love all kinds of music, but that's a big part of it for me. And when I was getting more and more into heavier music and darker music and more extreme music, that was right at the same time that I saw films like this, The Gate, and also other films that were going hand in hand with like the imagery and what I was thinking about when I was listening to that music. Bands, all of those bands I mentioned, but it was also my introduction to horror films. Movies like The Gate, and also another film I did a show on a little ways back called The Unholy, which was another big movie for me. Where it had satanic oriented themes. It was really dark. It had a sexual element, and then Friday the 13th. The list is endless. Tourist Trap, all those films. It all hit me at the same time, and that's when I really got fascinated by all things horror. And this was one of those movies. This was one of those key movies that got me into horror, and especially movies that dealt with like monsters, or movies that dealt with like a supernatural element, or an occult element. And this is an old school movie, and again, I don't have it on Blu-ray. I just have it on DVD, but I'm pretty happy. It's a really, it's a pretty decent copy. I need to get an upgrade on it. But this film came out, The Gate came out in 1987. It was directed by Tibor Tax. And again, this is like a super low budget horror movie. And this movie was also the first movie that Stephen Dorff was in. Stephen Dorff is a really well-known character actor. The most recent thing I saw him in was the second season of True Detective, which came out about a year ago. It's okay. It's pretty. He's great in it. The season itself is really, really good, but then the ending is. I felt the finale for the second season was a kind of a disaster and a letdown. All up until to that point, it's really, really good. The first season of True Detective is my all-time favorite show. I'm going to be doing a special show on that entire series or on that season very soon. But Stephen Dorff has been around for forever. He's been in films. He's been in Sofia Coppola films. He was also in the first Blade movie. So many movies he was in. I mean, the list is endless. I'll mention a few other films that he's been in. Just, just a tremendous amount of films. And, he's still going strong, but The Gate was his very first film ever as an actor. Uh, it's just wild. Um, he was in this movie that came out actually a few years ago called Embattled, which is a kind of a movie about mixed martial arts, and that's actually a pretty good movie. He was in a more recent movie called Old Henry, another movie called Felon, Blade, like I mentioned before, which came out in '98, which is, just a classic, one of the greatest vampire movies ever, with Wesley Snipes, based on the, iconic uh, comic book character. Somewhere, which was directed by Sofia Coppola, which is actually an awesome movie. He was in one of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies called Leatherface, which is pretty good. It's kind of an origins movie. It does fit within the franchise, and it's more or less like an origins movie that's centered around Leatherface, like his kind of like an origins movie. It's pretty good. It's actually pretty decent. I would like to see it again. I liked it because it felt, I don't know, had some kind of an original thing about it, but it is something I'd like to see again. And that came out 2017. Old Creek Manor is another movie he did. He's a really well respected character actor. He's been in so many different films. Um, the Price We Pay, which came out in 2022. Paradise City, The Power of One, 1992. The Immortals, which is an awesome movie. I forgot that he was in that. Fear.com. He was also in Officer Down, American Hero, Judgment Night. It's actually a pretty good movie, too. I'd like to see that again. Cecilville Demented, which was a pretty wild movie that he was in. Space Truckers, The Jackals, uh, just Blood and Wine, City of Industry. I mean, the list of films that Stephen Dorff has been in is just wild. But this was his debut. I believe this came out in 1987, and I think he was like, I don't know, 12 years old or something in this. And it's really funny because I was bringing up my whole like kind of my little side story about my relationship to, when I was a kid and I got into heavy metal music and then got into more extreme music and then eventually death metal and then black metal. That was the time when, you know t-shirts are still the thing as far as metal bands go, but like it was always about, I remember as a kid, same thing as how I discovered horror films, but basically you would, when I would go to the record shop to buy an album or a CD or a tape, or in my time it was a cassette, you would always go by song titles or the album covers. Like the more graphic that the album cover was, the more it increased your appetite to buy them. And it was also, so it was the time of like, you buy T-shirts with the album covers of certain bands on certain albums that you loved. You'd buy the T-shirts with all the crazy over the top gore soaked T-shirts. The jean jacket thing was a big thing, like where people would have jean jackets and you get the patches of the albums or the bands. You get those sewed in, and you'd walk around with like super happy and proud that you had those on. And it was the same thing for movies. That's how I discovered horror films, like going through the aisles and seeing, like, checking out the artwork and being like, wow, like that just looks so gory and insane. I got to see that. But the thing with the jean jacket thing was such a fun thing. And with the gate, it's centered on these kids. This movie's really cool because it's centered on this group of kids who like discover this like hole or patch of land in their neighbor's property, and it actually is what over time you discover it's kind of this portal that opens up these like gates to another dimension, like essentially the gates of hell, and they're able to commune with these demons and they're able to like bring about you know these these demons incarnate, and it's centered on these kids. And Stephen Dorff plays one of the kids, and a few of the other characters in it are all like these kids that are like basically in like eighth grade, ninth grade, and one of the main characters is like a total metal kid. He has like a jean jacket with the patches. He's all into metal music and has the records, and it's just it's hilarious. This movie also came out during the time of the Satanic Panic, so I think this film had a little play on that also. And the Satanic Panic was a time of where it was a time when and I've talked about it before, but there was a really terrible time in history where there were all of these supposed murders that were taking place in the 80s, and it went for like almost 10 years. There were all these like supposed satanic murders that were happening, where kids were being allegedly being kidnapped and abducted and used for satanic rituals, and during satanic rituals, and animals were getting mutilated, and there was like this whole big thing that was ended up becoming proven to be totally false, and something that was just created by these crazed Christian fundamentalists. And and so everything that had a little bit of an occult element, like metal music and horror movies, all these things were like being targeted. Things that were entertainment, were being accused of being, literally in league with the devil, and it ended up being just all BS. But this movie came out during that time, and it definitely is like a reflection of that time. I remember as a kid when that whole thing was happening, and it just made me more interested in wanting to check out movies with these kinds of themes, or bands with these kinds of themes. It only increased my desire as a kid to watch these things and to listen to these things. But watching this again, like I started watching this again last night. And I've seen this movie a bunch of times, but I started watching it last night, and I hadn't seen it in a couple of years. But I feel like this movie was totally ripped right from the headlines during the Satanic Panic. It's pretty funny, and it has a real like kind of comedic vibe to it. It kind of reminds me of a little bit of, it's a little bit of a stretch, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of like a movie like The Goonies. It has that classic, and it has almost like a family vibe to it, even though it's obviously pretty dark, and it's definitely a horror movie, which would probably prevent it from being accepted as a full-on family movie. But I thought, in regards to like the relationship with the kids and their families and their parents, and like what it's like to be a kid who's like, puberty is hitting you. You have all these hormones, and you have, you're into metal music, and you have interest in like, darker things, and you're kind of at odds with your other classmates who are not into that kind of music or that kind of, those kinds of aesthetics, and also with your parents. So it does it has that whole kind of thing, like a really, it's got a great focus on the kids and their dynamic, how it was to be a kid back then, and then also with the kids, like their relationship with their parents. And it's pretty funny, it's pretty silly and goofy, but that part of it kind of reminded me of The Goonies a little bit. Even though this is a lot more of a darker movie in some ways, and it's more of a horror movie. but it has that like kind of vibe, and it's great. It's a great movie. I was like again, I hadn't seen this in a few years, but I just started watching it again last night, and I was like, yeah, this totally has that vibe, even though it's definitely a horror movie. But it's awesome. It's 1987. It's the part of that golden decade of the 80s. The 80s was, I've always talked about it too. My two favorite decades are this, or I should say my three favorite decades. Now it's expanded even more, but like the 60s, particularly like the mid to late 60s, definitely the 70s without a doubt, and definitely the 80s. And the whole like horror, the super low budget science fiction kind of exploitation thing was in full throttle from the late 70s till about 80s, and it was also in the 60s. But the majority of those films came out in the 70s, late 70s, and into the mid 80s, and it kind of ended more or less, in the late 80s. I would say probably around 88, 89, maybe 90, where you had at the beginning of that decade there was like literally thousands of super low budget kind of horror exploitation movies coming out, that were just coming out from all over the world, all the European movies that were coming out, tons of American movies. There was it was a magical time for that style of film, and it was a huge thing. And then like about 87, 88, late 80s, early 90s, things kind of shifted and changed. There still are films that come out that are in that kind of genre, but the explosion of it kind of, it kind of died a little bit, in the late 80s. And The Gate was more or less kind of at the end of that. This was one of this came out, within 2 or 3 years of the end of the explosion of all of these films. But I still think, because of those characteristics and things about this movie, that I mentioned before, I still feel like it totally fits in that universe. And Tibor Tax, who was the director for The Gate, he's a Hungarian director. He made, The Gate, 1987, this movie right here. He also made a sequel, The Gate 2, Trespass, which I've never seen. I didn't even realize that there's a sequel. Spiders 3D in 2013. Ice Spiders, I, Madman, which he directed. Wow, I didn't realize that. And that's actually a really good movie. I have to check that out. That came out in 1989. I remember really liking that movie a lot as a kid, and it always, kind of creeped me out. But that would be a really cool movie to revisit. He also did Rocky Mountain, Kraken the Tentacles. Yeah, it's just that's one of the coolest things about checking out these films, buying them again, and revisiting them, and seeing films for the first time. Is I notice now when as I've gotten older, I've gotten like certain, like films like this, for instance, like movies that I really love or I grew up on, or movies like I've talked about on the Mono Macabre label, movies that I fall in love with for the first time. Is I find now, when I was a kid, I didn't really think about who the cinematographer was. I didn't really think about or care about per se really who the director was, or what company distributed the movie, or who did the music for the film, or even who some of the actors were. I just liked the movie just at face value. But now, as I've gotten older, now I don't know, I've become even more of a nerd. But now as I've gotten older, I have a deep fascination with finding out those things of like who the director is, and who scored the music, and who's the cinematographer, all those things. And that's one thing that's really different for me now as an adult and as an avid collector of these films. And so, case in point, watching this again now and revisiting it, now I'm like, okay, who is this director and what other movies did he do? Oh, he did I Man Man. I didn't realize he did that. I remember seeing that movie as a kid and I love that movie. It was a really cool, creepy horror movie. So I'm like, oh, I got to see that again. So that's the thing that happens now as an adult is all those little details I now really enjoy and trying, and I also spend time, doing research and checking out those things. So it's and all around, for me, all around, that's kind of what I'm all about these days, and it's super awesome and super cool. So yeah, The Gate, definitely check this out. 1987. It's kind of the epitome of super low budget horror exploitation. And it's a fun movie. It's a really fun movie. It was definitely, like I said in the beginning of the show, one of the movies that introduced me to a horror movie that had the elements of the occult, which is probably my two favorite styles in the world of horror and exploitation. I love, again, I've said it probably too many times, but I love all kinds of styles. I really like a newer one that and again, it was something I've seen some of those films when I was a kid, but I didn't know what it was or like what maybe where it derived from. But like giallo films are, that's a style of filmmaking that really is something pretty unique, and it's a style that it's definitely an Italian. It comes out of the Italian filmmaking school, and basically giallo films are kind of like the Italian version of like say like a classic Agatha Christie story or like a murder, a murder investigation story. And the giallo thing, came out in like early '60s even, and they and I really love those films. I discovered that I had seen some of those films growing up, but I didn't know what giallo was. I didn't know what that whole thing was. But since I've been revisiting some of those films that I saw when I was a kid, a movie like say Faceless by Jess Franco which is a horror movie, but it's very much a giallo film. Like that was a movie I used to see a lot as a kid, and I did a show on that a while back. But since like again, now I'm really interested in the details about a lot of these films that I love, and that's how it led me to there's this whole other style called giallo. Like what is that? And so that's like led me to kind of do a lot of research about those films. So the giallo thing itself is a newer genre, an older genre, but it's something I've been really digging into a lot, and I really love that style big time. But probably my two favorite, styles in the exploitation world is slasher films. Slasher films are my favorite. That's like my go-to, without a doubt. I love that style to death. You know, give me a good slasher film any day of the week, and I'm a happy guy. And then also horror movies that have a real kind of supernatural or like an occult element. That would be another real favorite of mine. And this is definitely one of those movies, and also one of the introduction, one of those films that introduced me uh, to that world. So yeah, 1987. Gotta check this out if you've never seen it. It's classic '80s. It's the debut of Stephen Dorff, a really great American actor. And I need to. This is only a DVD copy, but I need to buy this on Blu-ray at some point. So yeah, classic '80s horror exploitation right here. The Gate, 1987. So thanks again, everyone, for supporting this channel. If keep the comments coming, and if you like the content and what I'm doing with this channel, please like and subscribe and keep this thing growing even more. By days and days and by weeks and weeks. So thanks again. So have a great day. Peace.